In the ring of ideas, this is the heavyweight title fight. Time for a forensic analysis.
The world's corner is crowded. Atheists, Trinitarians, pantheists, it's a chaotic matchup.
Our job is to strip away the hearsay and see what the text actually says.
The first bell sounds.
People use generic titles like Lord or God, but does the creator have a personal name?
See, replacing the name with a title just creates confusion, so let's restore it.
With the name restored, the distinction is clear. A superstition removed it, we're putting it back.
The text is explicit. He states his name directly. There's no room for doubt here.
And that name? It's a guarantee. He becomes whatever is needed to get things done.
Now for the next contender, the Trinity doctrine. Let's audit this identity claim.
You have Jesus' own words, a direct statement. This points to a chain of command, not equality.
Look, if they were one being, they'd have the same info. The evidence points to a hierarchy.
Okay, round 3. Location. Is God an impersonal force or a person in a specific place?
First, let's define our terms. The Bible presents spirit as a state of being, not vague energy.
Here's the analogy. Radio waves. You can't see them, but they come from a single source.
So the text confirms it. He has a dwelling place, and his power projects out from there.
The final bell has rung. We've reviewed the evidence. Let's go straight to the scorecard.
These are the 3 decisive points. The name is Jehovah. He's superior to Jesus. He has a location.
This is the tip of the spear. For the full 60-minute forensic audit with Sarah and Mike, click the link in the description.
May your verses be sharp and your opponents unprepared.